The next up is Jonathan Gottschall, who teaches English at Washington Jefferson in Washington, Pennsylvania. He's working on bridging the humanities-sciences divide. You've noticed that I've been trying to get some literature into this as well, in the sense that there's an awful lot of books out there. I have one here, David Levitt's latest book, The Indian Clerk, which is about Ramanujan and Hardy, which is an exquisitely done novel about the serious life and times of mathematician and so on. So the same thing with Rebecca. This combination of literature and science I found very interesting, and I'm glad that you're working on it. He's co-editor with David Sloan Wilson of The Literary Animal, Evolution and the Nature of Narrative, and his next book will be Literature, Science and the New Humanities. So that's Jonathan Gottschall.
Thanks. Hi. I am Jonathan Gottschall. I'll be talking today also about the two cultures problem and how we can possibly find a way to bridge those, specifically in my home discipline of literary studies. I'm going to start with by telling you a little bit about a play by a Greek playwright named Aristophanes. The play was called The Clouds, and it is about 5th century Athens, which at the time, according to Aristophanes, is beset by intellectual plagues, lies, pseudoscience, chicanery, and all of it is emanating from the Sophists' academy. And Aristophanes calls the academy the Phronisterion, which means the thinkery. And there's all kinds of madcap adventures in the story, and the play is a satirical send-up of the Sophists, and especially of the leader of the sophistical movement, Socrates. The play finally ends when an ex-student who has come to understand the true nature of the institution goes out and sets fire to the thinkery and burns it to the ground. And he drives the charlatans from town with stones. And in keeping with Roger's suggestion that we throw intellectual bombs into the room, the bomb I will be throwing is into my own thinkery, modern academic literary study. And my hope isn't so much to burn the whole edifice to the ground, but possibly to purify it a bit with flame. The talk I'll be giving, as Roger mentioned, I have a book coming out next year called Literature, Science and the New Humanities. I better figure out how to work the PowerPoint. This one, okay. Yeah, it's called Literature, Science, and the New Humanities. And the first paragraph of the book is this: it's not such a good time to be a literary scholar. And by consensus, it is not. There's kind of shockingly strong consensus among all the normally squabbling tribes of literary theorists and intellectuals and critics that the field is floundering, aimless, increasingly irrelevant to the live concerns not only of the outside world, but to the world here inside the ivory tower. And there's trends that almost everyone agrees on. This isn't a controversial assessment. Enrollments are down, funding is down, morale is down, prestige is down. Books languish, unpublished, or unpurchased, because almost no one, not even other literary scholars, there's data on this, can bear to read them. So my question in the book is dedicated to this question: what are the wellsprings of these troubles, and what sorts of changes can we make to ameliorate them? I argue that the crisis in academic literary study derives from one primary, inescapable truth. There's probably some other factors also, but I think the major one is that literary scholars almost never succeed in accumulating information, knowledge, that can survive the critiques of the next generation. We almost never really figure anything out, with the exceptions of the historical and biographical branches. We have simply failed, almost utterly, to produce more reliable and durable information about the things we study. So simply put, the crisis, I am interpreting it as a product of disciplinary failure. As damning and as cruel-spirited as that may sound, I don't think it would be a particularly controversial assessment. Some of my colleagues might cavil and quibble over this point or that, but most would accept my assessment as true in the main, because it's sort of it's just a fact. Literary knowledge has not grown in a cumulative way in the main. So my question is this: if literary scholars have tried to produce more reliable, more durable information, and I argue that indeed most of them have, why have we almost always failed? I don't believe that the answer to that question is that there's some fundamental mysteriousness of humanity's questions, and I don't believe that the answer to the question is ineffable or hard to pin down. I think that the answer is actually very simple. It's rotten disciplinary fundamentals. So this is a very simple diagram of what I am talking about. This is a diagram of what I call the liberationist paradigm, which over the last several decades has provided the dominant structure for work in my field. So the first problem with this paradigm is theoretical. Contemporary literary theory is deeply rooted in theories of humans that are defunct. Psychoanalytic models and hard social constructivist models of human potential that basically amount to creationism from the chin up. Methodologically, strictly qualitative. Humanists lack methods for deciding which of our theory-generated hypotheses are closer to the truth. We forget that the role of method is not simply to allow us to demonstrate the correctness of our ideas. The role of method should be to act as a brake on the greed of all theory, the explanatory greed of all theory. And humanities or literary methods, I'll narrow my talk to just literary studies, but our methodologies largely fail in this latter duty. Our theories bully around our methods. And there's a literary scholar I admire named Frederick Crews who puts this very well. He says, in literary studies, our bogus experiments succeed every time. No determined literary scholar has ever failed to find evidence of his preferred idea. The third problem is attitudinal. It's a problem of ethos. I call the paradigm liberationist because it has been driven above all by an active commitment to achieving socio-political change, radical or progressive socio-political change, through scholarly means. And these powerful ideological commitments have distorted and disfigured everything we've produced over several decades. And my book is a response to this, and it's an optimistic response, I think. I think we can do better than this. What's most interesting, or one of the things that's very interesting to me about the crisis in the humanities is something almost invariable about discussions of it. And we're all discussing it. The crisis in academic literary studies. We're all discussing this. And what's interesting to me is that the yardstick of success is almost invariably provided by the sciences. So if we have plummeted in prestige and funding and public interest, that drop seems all the more sickening and vertiginous because the sciences keep soaring upwards in those categories. But we never seem to ask questions that seem obvious to me. What exactly are the sciences doing so right that we are doing so wrong? And can we emulate it? I don't see why not. I don't believe, as some of my colleagues do, that there's some inexorable law of epistemology that forever sunders the sorts of questions we ask from the sorts of questions that scientists ask. And I believe that we can accumulate more reliable and durable knowledge. We can move towards resolving the crisis. We can bring about a sort of disciplinary enlightenment, but only if we move closer to the sciences in theory, method, and ethos. Now, I don't think that this is to succumb to a servile scientism or to grovel in imitation of scientific betters or to turn quisling to humanistic concerns and values. I think it's simply to say that humanists shouldn't let disciplinary rivalry or complacency keep us from addressing our questions with the best tools that are available. So this is a shift in paradigm that I am promoting in the book. This is the new humanities that is referenced in the title. And so in place of defunct theory, inadequate methods, and distorting ideologies, we'd simply replace those things with sounder disciplinary fundamentals. We'd substitute literary theory that is consilient with scientific knowledge and grounded ultimately in a flexible, evolution-based understanding of human nature. We would substitute a more adequate, more diverse methodological toolkit that absolutely retains tools of qualitative tools of close reading and careful reasoning, but also applies methods of scientific quantification when we can. So my prescription is not only that scholars should know more about science, as C.P. Snow said a long time ago, but that literary scholars should actually be doing science. Where possible, we can and should make use of the methodology. And finally, we would substitute the pursuit of disinterested inquiry, which is not to embrace the fantasy that humanistic or scientific inquiry can be pristinely objective and value neutral. But for decades, people in my field have mistaken the fact that it's difficult to be objective for a license to give up trying utterly. So there are a lot of different ways to work in this vein, but I'm currently most excited by attempts to address literary questions in a methodologically scientific way. And I imagine that's what you guys would rather hear about also, because the idea of literary science sounds oxymoronic or even laughably oxymoronic to most ears. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of the sort of work that I have in mind. All of them involve simply stealing, wholesale theft, and adaptation of methodologies in use in other fields. I'm not going to tell you much about these, the details. I would acknowledge these are all early and imperfect efforts, but I'm advancing them really only as proof of concept. And the concept is that the great methodological wall separating the humanities and the sciences has no substance. It's a failure, a figment of our imaginations. So maybe you guys have heard this first one before, this mantra that the author is dead. It's sort of a shibboleth in modern literary theory, and just to simplify it a little bit, it suggests that authors have no power over us. That we are not so much the readers of literary works as they're writers. We rewrite them as we read, and we interpret them in highly idiosyncratic ways. They mean different things to different people, and we feel differently about them. It's all sort of chaos. But like much else that passes for knowledge in contemporary literary theory, there's almost nothing behind this aside from the authority of the presenter. So my colleagues and I tested this assertion by looking at the actual emotional and analytic responses of 500 literary scholars and avid readers to characters from a selection of classic 19th century British novels, stuff that a lot of us have read in the room, Jane Eyre and sort of canonical 19th century stuff. And our conclusion was pretty unequivocal, at least in this study, is that the author lives. Rumors of his demise have been greatly exaggerated. Our respondents did have some range of variation in how they responded to the characters. But that variation was tightly, expertly constrained by our authors within pretty narrow normative ranges. Biochemistry and Chaucer, I think this is really neat. There's a study, there's actually a few studies, but this is the one that's most impressive to me. There's an article in Trends in Genetics a few years ago where Cambridge University biochemists traced the evolutionary history of the Chaucerian manuscript tradition in exactly the same way they do it, in the way they study common ancestry in different biological lineages. They studied rates of error in the manuscripts in the same way they study rates of mutation in the genetic texts of A's, C's, T's, and G's. And this has been adopted into the Chaucerian scholarly community as helpful work. Stylometry and Shakespeare's co-author. Stylometric studies are computerized crunchings of sentences that can help identify in a probabilistic way an author's stylistic fingerprint. And these studies have helped to settle, according to some observers, there's still some controversy about it, but according to some well-placed observers, have helped to settle long and angry debates about whether or not Shakespeare wrote some of his plays with co-authors. And the answer, according to these studies, is that very probably he did. And the stylometric studies are able to identify not only who the authors were, but what plays they contributed to, and even what passages they wrote versus what Shakespeare wrote. And finally, again with some colleagues of mine, over the last 7 years or so, I've been using large cross-cultural databases to test hypotheses that sort of overlap the sciences and the humanities. Just to give one example, we have addressed the problem of where the apparently greater emphasis on women's physical attractiveness that you find in Western societies comes from. Is it a social construction that functions as a hammer of patriarchy, which is a sort of standard position in literature departments and social sciences departments? Or is it an end product of the evolutionary process, the different selection pressures men and women faced throughout deep time? So these make pretty clear predictions. This is a graphical illustration of our study. The constructivist position predicts that you should find variation as you cross cultural boundaries, chronological boundaries. And you see we have a very diverse sample here. We have all levels of cultural complexities, bands, tribes, pre-industrial states. They're all traditional societies. They're all originally oral tales. And we have chronological diversity spanning from the mid-19th century up until almost the present. And when you have this kind of big, diverse sample, a social constructivist position would suggest that you should have pretty massive variability. You should find cultures where there's more emphasis on male physical attractiveness. You should find cultures where it's equal, and you should find cultures where there's more emphasis on the female, and perhaps a version of the evolutionary position would predict that that there will be variation, sure, but it'll be much smaller, and the rule of greater emphasis on female attractiveness will only be violated, if at all, in anomalous societies. So, in a process using human coders and computers, we simply counted physical attractiveness references in these tales in a really brute force sort of way, and the results favored the evolutionary perspective strongly, and were at odds with the constructivists. Wherever we went and whenever we went there, that we found more emphasis on female than male attractiveness, and the gap was much bigger than we expected. About 6 references in these folktale collections across the board to female physical attractiveness for every reference to male physical attractiveness. And it didn't matter where we looked. So Europe ends up being, there's quite a lot in Europe. It was a lot of this work was testing ideas that are coming out of feminist studies of the Western folktale. And actually, the feminists were absolutely right in noting that there's this huge gap between the way that men are described in the folktales and the way that women are described in the folktales. But the assumption they made was that was the hammer of patriarchy falling, and it was a sort of completely arbitrary thing that was invented by Western patriarchs, and it may be related to patriarchy, but the feminist position did not predict that you're going to find this thing everywhere, from Australian Aborigines to Japan, Europe, India, Africa, Northwest coastal Indian population, Southwestern American Indians, and so forth down the line. And of course, we could be wrong. And I myself can think of several ways where we could have gone wrong, either in skewing our numbers or in the way we interpret our numbers. But the fact that any of these studies I've summarized may be wrong is, in fact, the most exciting and interesting and important thing about them. That's what's most important. Because the major barrier to the production of durable knowledge in literary studies, it's been almost the sheer impossibility of demonstrating that anyone is wrong. And since no one could be wrong, no one could possibly be right. And so this is the thing that, for me, suggests that deep disciplinary change really is possible, and that literary study really can be a field where more durable, reliable knowledge accumulates. There are some obstacles standing in the way of this, big obstacles, mainly big tenured professors at big schools. But this vision has at least one strength in its favor. It's like the dominant liberationist paradigm, which casts literary scholars as the questing moral heroes of academia and the fearless iconoclasts. This is an ambitious, even idealistic vision of what a scholar of literature, even a scholar of literature, can accomplish. By moving closer to the sciences, literary scholars can once again have actual consequence outside the narrow, shrinking preserves of their own societies, conferences, and journals. Nathoi Seotan, know thyself. We can make more reliable and durable contributions to the study of literature. And we can also participate more fully in revealing the ultimate subject of the humanities, which is humans. So by reimagining our approach to knowledge generation, we can rejoin the oldest and still the premier quest of the disciplines, which is to better understand ourselves and our place in the universe. And so I end the book with the sentence, perhaps it's a good time to be a literary scholar after all. So, thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Quick question maybe from anybody while we're changing over. Dan, you have a question?
I think that's wonderful, very heartening, and I hope you succeed beyond your wildest dreams in this effort. Now, if only we can get somebody to do the same thing in cultural anthropology, that's very much called for too. And my own field of philosophy has some problems of this sort, but in a way, I don't think, in some regards, they're as bad, because there's still an abiding aspiration to getting it right and to truth.
Right.
And I recall many years ago, actually, this was my first insight into the problem you're discussing, when I was a young philosopher and this very eminent literary theorist came to see me, and sort of hat in hand, and what he wanted from me was, quote, an epistemology, close quote. It doesn't matter what it was. It was just, it should be new. He was accessorizing. Yeah. And you know, the smart people this year were wearing an epistemology, and he wondered if I had anything on my rack for him. And that was the beginning of my appreciation of what the problems were in literary theory.
David Albert at the back. Oh, all right. So, Deirdre, you've got one?
Yes. I mean, as a professor of English, I can't join in completely in the spirit of tromping on English departments. I agree with you that this idea that English professors ought to be the avant-garde of these socialist revolution is unattractive and unscholarly and bad for the field. But you start from the argument that there hasn't been any progress in our understanding. And I just don't think that's true if you take a longer perspective. If you go back to I.A. Richards and practical criticism all the way through to Stanley Fish and reader responses to studies of poetry. So I wonder if you would agree that the rot is not characteristic of the humanities always. Indeed, this example that you give of Chaucer is somewhat surprising, because that kind of argument is the oldest humanistic argument since the invention of printing. It's the way that classicist and biblical scholars have always operated.
Yeah.
So I don't see that as new. In fact, it's an old.
It's an improvement of the old. It's an improvement though of the old methodology.
Oh, I don't.
Much more powerful computing and.
Really?
Yeah.
One more question, David Albert.
Wait, sorry. Answered the question.
Oh, I thought he was answering.
Is this new, or are you making a claim about the last 100 years?
Is what new?
Is the rot new?
Good question. Good question.
Well,
one of the things about the crisis in the humanities is this is a big cliche, and you can go back to the 1920s, and we're having the same existential moaning then that we were now. And a good date to say that academic literary studies was invented was about 1883, when the Modern Language Association was invented. And there, in those early founding documents, you see the same anxieties reflected then that you see now. What are literature departments for? Mere chatter about Shelley? What are literary scholars supposed to do? Isn't it just like professional dilettantism? So no, the crisis is not new. I'd say that we are at a particularly acute stage, though, of a crisis that's basically as old as the discipline itself. But this stage, I do think, is especially acute.